Hello and welcome to the show that debates, deconstructs and demystifies burning issues of the day. This is The Big Picture and I am Athar Khan. With just over a month left to bridge the yawning gap in its finances, the government needs to raise some cash in a hurry. Hard-pressed for funds, the government is looking to garner an additional 7,000 crore rupees by persuading state-owned companies to increase their dividend payout for FY12, taking the total collection in the current fiscal to over 30,000 crore rupees. In addition, the government expects to rake in 1,500 crores through dividend distribution tax or DDT in the current fiscal. The government has been facing financial problems on account of its rising subsidy bill and poor receipt from disinvestment. The fiscal deficit for 2011-2012 is expected to exceed the budget target of 4.6% of the GDP. Now, the usual route would be to turn to the markets to raise some capital. But with the volatility in the markets continuing, the government is trying a different tack. Instead, some new ideas have been mooted in recent months to make state-owned enterprises divert their cash. The latest move is SEBI's decision to allow companies to dilute promoter holdings through institutional placement programs, or IPPs as they are known. Tonight on The Big Picture, we take a look at the public sector in India. We'll debate the best way forward for PSUs, and we'll also discuss the efforts of the government to bridge the gap in the deficit by using PSUs to pay higher dividends. I'm joined in the studio by Professor S.Krishna Kumar on my extreme left. He teaches economics at Delhi University, as well as Soma Banerjee, National Economic Editor with The Economic Times, and R.S.Sharma, former chairman of NTPC. I'd like to start the show, though, with you, Mr. Sharma. Traditionally, the Indian investor has been partial, if I could use that word, towards public sector offerings in terms of sound returns of cash. All the big ticket offerings like Coal India and ONGC were lapped up by the investor. Now, there is a general feeling, and I'm not saying this, there is a general feeling that whenever the economy is not doing well, or when it's doing well, the private sector is booming, PSUs, public sector enterprises, are labeled as laggards or a bit of a dead weight. Whenever the economy dips, there's a recession, suddenly everyone runs towards PSU. Do you agree with that? And is that a fair assessment?
Well, let me start with this, that PSUs are not the dead weights. PSUs are the backbone of the national economy. And the proof for this is 2007-8, when there was a recession in the USA and Europe, and then how the PSU stood the ground. It was only PSU who really could sustain at that particular time. So, really what I will like to say, that PSUs have contributed in a big way to the government exchequer.
Right, absolutely. But Shoma, let me get to this. Like you said, PSUs are the backbone of any economy. But do you agree with that? The feeling that one gets when the economy is in trouble, run to the PSUs, get some cash very quick. Yeah. But when it's not doing well, PSUs, nobody asks them.
Yeah, so I come back to the question which you put, that PSUs perform better when you are in recession. PSUs don't perform or are laggards and deadweight when the things are going good. I think it's just a question of perception. When things are going good, there is no attention or little media space also devoted to public sector because we're too busy covering the glories of the private sector. When goings are bad and the private sector is not delivering, the government and every stakeholder looks back toward the PSUs because they are the ones who are expected to do the public spending, to really boost the economy, to see that economic activity goes forward. And that is why you find that public sector does well during recession. I think they do well, or they are consistent, good or bad, throughout the time. It's a question of perception and noticing them, which happens more during the bad times because the other sectors are not doing so well, whereas it's not so much when you're in a...
I agree with you completely. Yeah. It's a matter of perception. But do you agree there is a sort of, I don't like to use the word stepmotherly treatment, but by the government as well as the media at times?
Yeah, I agree completely. And to an extent, the argument that is put forward is that the government is the owner of the PSU. So it's their baby, how they want to treat it. But I think the thing changes once these companies get listed, once you have other investors in the company. It's all right if it's a 100% held government company and they want to do what they want with it, just like you mentioned, going in for dividend tax or asking them to give you special dividends. We've seen all that happen even in the past, and this is not anything new that the government is trying to do. Yeah. Whenever it's in trouble, it is the PSUs that are expected to bail out.
I see Krishna Kumar shaking his head, nodding his head
in fact, I fully agree with what Soma was just mentioning about. There's always a counter-cyclical role which often the public sector plays. And in fact, the counter-cyclical role which is expected of the public sector would be all the more, much more particularly during times of recession, and that's exactly why the attention actually falls on them. Not that the public sector was not performing well, but it's also good to hear from the press and also from the media and from the people at general the public sector doing well, because one of the rationale which we are putting during the 1991 reforms package was the public sector is failing to deliver. And now we are actually trying to rediscover, not just we as a country, but worldwide we find that there's a focus towards actually having a balancing act of having some sort of an attention on the public sector as much as when you try to trigger the private sector, because there are a lot of bottlenecks, particularly infrastructure bottlenecks, where possibly the government enters and plays a very pivotal role. The public sector enters and reaches out even to the underreached areas and regions and triggering in new scope of hope towards industrialization.
I know you want to say something, so I'll get back to that. But let me come to Mr. Sharma first. Recently, we heard that SEBI is going to allow new guidelines. They're coming up with new guidelines and try a different tack instead of an FPO. What they're trying to do is private placement, IPP as they're called. Do you think that was the right move by SEBI at this juncture? Do you think it'll help investors, especially retail investors, at all? Instead of the FPO route?
I think I will request probably Professor Krishna Kumar, can you say something on that? I may not be.
All right, we'll change that completely. We'll go to Soma on the same question. Do you think the SEBI was right in actually at this juncture? Do you think IPP is better than FPO at this juncture?
I don't really agree, because I think it's basically the investor sentiment. And if the investor sentiment is low, then it's low from retail as well as institutional investors. True institutional investors have a different appetite and can come in even when the chips are not so up, because they're not looking for returns tomorrow. So they may be willing to put in their money now. But at this point, I think there is a general feeling of downturn in the global economy. There is a general sentiment which is running against the market sentiment everywhere. And India is no exception. We have been a little better off in January. We've seen FII flows coming in. We've seen some sort of a cycle change. But I don't think that this is really the way to go ahead. Particularly, I think the government needs to make up its mind what it wants to do with its PSUs. It cannot have commercial interest as well as social interest going side by side as far as PSUs are concerned.
How is an IPP or an OFS, an offer for sale, better than an FPO? People say that FPO is an elaborate process, and sometimes because they're priced lower to new investors, retail investors kind of lose out. Do you agree with that? And what is the best way forward anyway?
No, because through the former route, what happens is that there will be a controlling stake which that particular institution which would be buying a good chunk of the shares would have on it. So there often this trade-off between the social concerns and profitability will come to the fore, because after a particular dominant player entering into a public sector unit and holding a very good chunk of the total shares in it, when they start actually trying to put forward the profit-making role over the social concerns, there would always be sometimes something in the sort of a medium-term interest of the larger macroeconomy being hurt. For example, now we continue to have the public sector as a bulwark against the cyclical tendencies in the economy, precisely because we are having, say, dispersed ownership of shares amidst the people other than the government's single holding.
Right.
And in this juncture, when the government is thinking in terms of asking for dividend payment to the government rather than offloading it in the market, it's precisely because the government knows for sure that the market is not liquid indeed to subscribe to it, and possibly it might not pick up and yield the sufficient returns.
In fact, if I may just add in a small example, you saw what happened with Goldman Sachs holding in ONGC. I mean, they were the institutions who raised the point about the fact that the government is constantly taking money away as subsidies from ONGC. Retail investors, actually, in India at least, haven't come to such a fore that they can raise these issues. But an institutional investor is not going to willingly allow the money to be ripped off from it.
Hold that. We'll have to take a short break right now. After the break, we'll talk about the fiscal deficit. The government is trying to raise some cash via the PSU route. All that and lots more after the break. Don't go anywhere. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching The Big Picture. Krishna Kumar, if I could just come to you directly. The fiscal situation is in a mess. Everyone agrees to that. The deficit will obviously shoot past that the target. I think it's already reached 80, if I'm not wrong, 85.6% of the target for the full financial year. Now, the government also has some plans on the table, especially regarding the SUTI, the SUUTI, the Special Undertaking of the Unit Trust of India, that special vehicle. Now, SUTI holds shares worth an estimated 30,000 crore rupees. One option that the government is propounding, they haven't decided on it yet, but they're propounding that dismantle the SUTI completely by selling off all its stake. Do you think that would be a good idea at all?
See, when it comes to this large stock sales, I do not know to what extent the yield from the large stock sales, because if you're a big seller and if you enter into the market to offload into to cover the deficit, one need not expect the same result to come. But the point with which you were starting, the question of fiscal deficit, during these times when there is a shortage of demand in the economy, it's not just in India. Worldwide, we find that there is a fiscal profligacy. Though profligacy is used as a bad word, it's considered to be a good word during times of recession, because if you do not have a buoyant international market where your exports were going, and most of our export sector where labor-intensive tasks were happening, if labor is basically being laid off, during this particular time to serve as a buffer, somehow the government will have to yield to fiscal deficits. It's not as to what our short-term fiscal deficit is. What our medium-term performance in the fiscal front is what is important.
Right. So, if I could come to you on that, if it happens that the government is forced to sell off all the stake in SUTI, won't that forced selling sort of depress the overall market and prevent SUTI from achieving what it's worth in the market?
I mean, firstly, I think there is a technical issue out here because SUTI holdings are in companies which have strategic importance. For instance, selling off stake in ITC, which is one of the companies, L&T and Axis Bank, right? These are the three institutes. In ITC, that's a tobacco hold company. BAT is waiting any day to lap it up. I do not think the Indian government or India would want BAT to cut that strategic stake in a tobacco company. Number two, take L&T. L&T is also into defense equipment production. I mean, there is no question that India would want this to be taken up by another. So there is a technical issue with dissolving SUTI. They're thinking of creating a SPV which is going to take this money. Now, you're right about the fact that if you have a huge volume of shares being put out in an already depressed market, it will not get you the right kind of value. And I agree completely with Krishna Kumar that this is a question of short-term and medium-term. Look, this is a year which has seen the worst of times. We are suffering from long things. It's time that we look at subsidies. It's time we looked at effective delivery systems for subsidies to cut our fiscal deficit rather than sell shares in distress.
Right, we'll talk about share buyback as well, but before that I want to come to Mr. R.S.Sharma and very quickly if I could, sir, what about PSUs in general? What about their autonomy? What is the relationship with the government right now? And do you think PSUs need more autonomy to function better?
Yeah, certainly the PSUs have got all the ingredients for the success, except for one thing that they really do not have that sort of autonomy. And when I say the autonomy, that means probably as the government-owned company, you have got lot many controls which are available there. The controls are good, but probably they are required to align themselves with the market, with the technology infusions and all those things. And this is where somewhere the policies come in the way. So autonomy, let us say for the board, let us say if the board has taken a decision, that the decision must be honored by each and every one.
Right.
Where there are the independent directors and where there are the government-appointed directors.
Right. I understand what you're saying. The autonomy issue obviously is a big issue for PSUs, and appointment of independent directors has been sort of tardy, if I could use that word. Coming back to Soma on the share buyback issue, now the government is also considering the buyback option from cash-rich PSUs. There could be a slight problem there in case the PSUs don't want to do that and use that money for their own benefit.
I think this matter is kind of settled in some sorts, I would say, with the Prime Minister's office actually intervening and taking a meeting with all the cash-rich PSUs and seeing at their capital spend. Again, it's a question for the government. Do they want the government to their companies to spend the money and give the money through the government to see a better fiscal position? Or do they want these companies to spend this money usefully in the economy by investing capital investments when everybody else is shying away. I think capital investment is what is the call of the day, because they need future growth, they need more jobs, they need economic activity to come in, which is not going to come away if they're going to use their reserve cash in just transferring from a company book to a government book, because it's just buying, paying Peter to satisfy Paul.
right.
So I think at this point, the PSUs have made it also clear, at least the bigger PSUs with the big money, that they have huge capex plans and they do not want them to go already at such time. They need to do their investments, whether it's mining, whether it's drilling, whether it's production. And I think they're right in saying so. And there again, the question comes of autonomy. Where is the company's autonomy to decide, this is not a good market, I don't want to go in here, or this is a good market and I want to go in here. The value for the company, I mean, every company and its independent board should be able to decide that irrespective of the ownership.
Krishna Kumar, what about the other option?
And another issue is also this thing that even leading private sector giants who are sitting over huge chunks of cash are in fact refusing to enter into this process of capital expenditure. At that time, if there is a sense that they would actually go in for capital expenditure rather than asking them to buy back the shares and enhance the ownership of the company on which already they have got a good control ownership, it would be a really foolish decision from the
What
part
about
of
the other option that the government has on the table, inter-PSU investment, forcing one PSU to buy from another PSU? Do you think it's a viable option at all?
There are a set of PSUs which are profit-making, and there are a set of PSUs which are loss-making. Now, if you're asking the profit-making PSUs to go and put their money into loss-making PSUs, and it would actually be trying to make things worse sometimes. And you cannot actually coerce a particular public sector unit which is actually doing now well, and which does not require the government aid to now enter into or tinker into certain other PSUs and make its own financial condition bad. Because at least for the time being, we have a set of Navaratnas, etc., who are performing very well and who are actually trying to compete and create space for themselves, not just as brands for the, it's almost become brands for the country of sorts. They're actually much more, with matchless capacities compared to even the private sector. Because when we speak about cash reserves in different private sector units, we have cash reserves in the public sector units also. So it should be left to the autonomous decision of the boards concerned, whether they would like to have a controlling stake on some of them, or whether they can relieve those particular loss-making units on their own. It should be left to the decision of that particular public sector.
Right. Shoma, very quickly, if you could, we have to go into another break. But before that, I'd like to ask you, doesn't the current situation also suggest a short-term outlook for PSUs? Doesn't it, like plugging the fiscal deficit by raising funds from PSUs, doesn't that suggest a short-term strategy? What about the long-term?
And it's a very, and I don't think that it's a very wise decision from what we hear from economists as well as people who can see more into the market, that actually getting your PSUs to fund your deficit is surely just some sort of a facade or some sort of a what do you call that, book management which you do, because primarily it is the government money which is going into funding your deficit, whereas the government money which is parked in the PSU should actually be led towards economic activity, which the private sector may not be willing to do at this stage, whereas these companies can be forced to go in for greater economic activity, which alone can help in reversing the situation. So fiscal deficit, I think, as he mentioned it, and I agree completely, is the picture dismal across the world. And like he said, profligacy is probably a good word at these times. Rather, the government should look at its expenses and its subsidies, which can really cut your fiscal deficit.
Profligacy, rather controversial word. We'll take another break right now. We'll talk about how the government wants higher dividends this fiscal year. After the break, do not go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're still watching The Big Picture, and we are with Soma, Banerjee, Krishna Kumar, and R.S.Sharma. R.S.Sharma, I'd like to ask you this. The DEA secretary has been meeting PSU heads over the past month or so to try and convince them to pay higher dividends this year. Thoughts?
This higher dividend payout, if you see from the government point of view, certainly the government may be right in really asking for the higher dividend payout to meet the fiscal deficits. But let me tell you, if you really look from the PSU point of view, ultimately what I would like that really when there are lot many things or economic activity are really required to happen, when the lot many things are required to be done for the infrastructure, for the manufacturing, for lot many things, I think it should be left to the PSUs alone if they have got their capex plan. If really they have got their plan to infuse that particular expenditure for the technology or for aligning with the market, etc., they should be allowed to first go there, and then only it should be done. This is what I would like to say. The first preference should be that the companies should be allowed to have their capex plan met. And ultimately, the capex plan are quite long. It's not for a year or two. It's about 5 years, 10 years, and all those things. So rather, there has to be a balance between the both. This is what I would like to say.
Soma, thoughts on DEA secretary meeting PSUs to convince them to fire?
Well, I think firstly it's a bad thought. Robbing PSUs to manage a fiscal deficit is not a good thought.
Slightly unfair, would you say?
It's unfair, and I think it's a very short vision. It's not a long-term vision. You're not really thinking your things out because PSUs need to do their activity. But more than that, I would think what they really need to do is to actually look at their revenues, and revenues not by forced dividend payouts or buybacks or public offer. I think they can really do with coming back with some of the duties which they're taken away. For instance, come back with your customs duty on crude. You actually took away and made it zero when it was $160. Today, crude is at $100, less than $100. Even a 5% duty on customs crude can really give you a huge lot of revenue, and direct revenue, which you can do. You can take back your economic stimulus packages. You can put in a 2% excise duty on the negative list of products. So why does the government have to wait for a budget? It does not have to wait for a budget to do this. It can do this right away, and it could mop up a little bit of revenue, which it can. And see, things like crude, I mean, you're not going to do away with importing crude. So why not get that revenue back? You did it because things were normal. Things are better now, and I think it's time they get back to do things. So this, I think, is a better option of doing things. Targeting subsidies better, managing your revenues and coming back with some of the duties is better, rather than making PSUs poorer, who anyway are your guys who are going to invest and let the economy.
Krishna Kumar, do you agree with that?
I really think that if you're taking this sort of short-termish measures, then what would happen is that a medium-term goal of trying to slightly enhance tax to GDP ratios, it would actually be cold storage, it will be refrigerated, it will become a non sequitur. And now on one excuse or another, if you're basically going to actually, like how she said, rob Peter and pay Paul, this sort of a strategy would not work. So best is to target properly tax mobilization as a strategy. And of course, in the short term, I would not even think that withdrawal of stimulus would be a good idea, because expenditure is required. In the current specific parameters of the economy, expenditure is definitely warranted.
Let's talk about listing new PSUs who are unlisted till now, incentivizing them to list. The government has been trying the MOU method. Do you think that is successful at all, where an enterprise signs a MOU with the PSU, and then they get the CEO, whoever gets appraisal as and by they go along? Do you think the MOU system has worked at all? Because HAL has the money, so does Heavy Engineering Corp Limited, but they haven't listed yet. Do you think the MOU system has been successful at all?
Well, I think the MOU is more of a target setting which the government does with the public sector companies to see that their targets are met. This has been the age-old practice, and it's been going on. We need to relook it. We need to look at, have a review at it. About listing PSUs, I personally am against listing PSUs unless and until the government is clear as to what is its objective with PSUs. I completely feel that it's not proper to get a company listed, to expect it to perform as per every other company listed, but also meet your social objectives. And look at all the PSU oil companies. They're fantastically run companies. It is their people who are actually going to the private sector. Mr. Sharma is an example. He's an ex-NTPC person go in Jindal today. So the manpower is there, the talent is there, the resources are there. What is not there is the commercial objective. And I can understand the government has social objectives. It needs to do that. So keep them as government companies. Do not make them market listed and then expect them to perform as a social sector objective. It's not possible. The two don't go together.
Because there's huge financial under-recoveries, because the public sector is being owned
and they
by
get
the
a bad
government.
name for no reason of theirs. I mean, no fault of theirs. They get a bad name because the government decides you sell at this price, which is way below the cost price, and they are making losses, and then the government bails out, and then you have MPs in parliament saying, why is this happening?
I think Mr. Sharma wants to say something.
Yeah, what I would like to say on the MOU part, MOUs certainly have done pretty well. I will not like to
So
say.
you agree the
because
system
I have
has
been
worked?
part. Yes,
That what
system
you
has
say?
worked well. What has been the flaw? The MU parameters, when being set, probably they require more in-depth analysis and fixing up those targets. Number one, that one. Number two, I will like to say that listing of the PSC into the market, particularly those which are the profit making, certainly must be done.
Right,
Ultimately, that provides them a visibility.
Right.
And when there is visibility, that means they are known. They will be facing the competition and all those things, and that makes the board and that makes the employees to
Right.
function more
Right,
effectively.
we're almost out of time, but Shoma, I'd like to ask you one more question. Long-term privatization has been contested politically at one stage or the other, one of the most difficult economic reforms to be implemented. What is the way forward? How important is building political consensus on this particular issue?
I think the government needs to make up its mind where it needs to be. I mean, see, we divested out of modern foods. Do we regret it? The fact that government doesn't make bread, I don't think we regret it. So the government needs to find out where it needs to stay invested. Infrastructure sectors, yes. Core sectors, yes. Strategic important sectors, yes. But there are several things in which the government really has no business being in today. Those companies definitely need a sellout, a privatization, call it what you want, give it a better name because privatization is a bad word which nobody likes to stick to. Find a more innovative name which even people like Mamta Banerjee will buy into.
Right,
Forget the
right,
left.
right.
And I think it will work. But as a strategy, I think it's just about the government deciding where they need to be and where they do not. I mean, look at Coal India today. I think it's the biggest example. It's a huge monolith of a company. It controls more than 80% or 90% of the market. And you have a situation where the country is importing coal to meet its present requirement. So, I mean,
I think that'll be the last word on the show. We're completely out of time. I think the key takeaway today, of course, from our panelists was that the short-term strategy that we're looking at in terms of PSU disinvestment has to go. We have to look at long-term strategy, long-term planning so that we make best use of our PSUs in India. It's time for us to go right now. We'll end the show here. Till next time, till we get another edition of The Big Picture. Thank you and goodbye, and thanks for watching.